By the summer of 1945, Japan had lost its navy, its cities, and its empire. Yet one question remained unresolved in Washington: whether ending the war would require executing a god, or finding a way to use him. This channel examines World War II through the moments when assumptions hardened, decisions narrowed, and history moved forward with fewer options than anyone expected. If you're new here, consider subscribing. Now, let's begin. In August 1945, the war in the Pacific ended on paper. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese population by radio, announcing acceptance of the Allied surrender terms. It was the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard his voice. The message was brief, formal, and deliberately opaque. It did not mention defeat. It spoke instead of endurance. From the perspective of American planners, the war's central military objectives had been achieved. Japan's navy no longer existed as a fighting force. Its air arm had been exhausted. By the summer of 1945, sustained bombing had destroyed large portions of Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of regional cities. 2 atomic detonations, on August 6 and August 9, had erased Hiroshima and Nagasaki from operational planning altogether. Japan's capacity to continue organized warfare was gone. Yet the end of combat did not resolve the larger strategic problem facing the United States. Victory had created a new question, one that doctrine, intelligence estimates, and historical precedent struggled to answer. How do you occupy a country that has not psychologically surrendered? American war planning had always assumed that surrender and compliance were linked. Defeat on the battlefield was expected to translate into submission afterward. This assumption had held in Europe. Germany's collapse in May 1945 had been followed by administrative disintegration, mass displacement, and exhaustion. The Nazi state dissolved quickly once its leadership was removed and its territory occupied. Japan did not fit this model. By mid-1945, American intelligence assessments described a society still structured around obedience, hierarchy, and ritual loyalty. The emperor remained at the apex of that structure. Although Japan's civilian government had formally accepted surrender, the institution of the emperor remained intact. More importantly, it remained believed in. Before the war, Japanese state ideology had presented the emperor not merely as a constitutional monarch, but as a living embodiment of the nation. He was described in official doctrine as sacred, inviolable, and beyond political accountability. Military oaths were sworn in his name. Civil authority flowed downward from his position, not upward from the people. This belief system had not collapsed with the bombing. American planners now faced a contradiction. They had destroyed the Japanese military, but they had not dismantled the symbolic structure that had sustained it. The war had ended, but the system that gave meaning to sacrifice, obedience, and endurance remained operational. By September 1945, as occupation planning accelerated, U.S. Army intelligence summaries began to flag the same concern repeatedly: the Japanese population might comply outwardly while resisting inwardly. The fear was not immediate revolt. It was something more difficult to contain: passive resistance, local non-cooperation, and decentralized violence, sustained over years rather than weeks. The geography of Japan reinforced this concern. The country's interior was mountainous, forested, and poorly suited to rapid mechanized control. Its rural regions had supplied the Imperial Army with soldiers who were accustomed to operating in small units, often with limited logistics. American planners were aware that even a fraction of those forces, operating independently, could complicate occupation indefinitely. The emperor sat at the center of that calculation. To many American officers, the question of Emperor Hirohito was framed as a moral issue. He had reigned during the war. Orders had been issued in his name. Declarations of expansion, mobilization, and sacrifice bore his seal. Under conventional Allied principles, leaders associated with aggressive war were subject to prosecution. But occupation planning was not driven by courtroom logic. It was driven by arithmetic. Staff officers began circulating estimates of occupation requirements under different scenarios. If the emperor were removed, they projected increased troop requirements to maintain order. If he were executed or publicly humiliated, they anticipated prolonged instability. One internal estimate suggested that an occupation without the emperor's cooperation could require hundreds of thousands of additional troops for years. These figures mattered. By late 1945, the United States was already demobilizing. Millions of soldiers were returning home. Public tolerance for extended overseas deployments was limited. Europe required resources. Asia remained unstable. China was sliding toward renewed civil war. The American military did not have unlimited capacity to manage resistance across another hostile population. The assumption that justice would naturally produce stability began to weaken. In Tokyo, advance occupation elements reported early signals that reinforced these concerns. Japanese officials continued to operate ministries efficiently. Police forces remained intact. Civil order was largely preserved. This compliance was not spontaneous. It was issued downward, through existing authority channels. And those channels still terminated at the emperor. American officers noticed a pattern. When imperial directives were issued, ordering cooperation, discouraging violence, instructing officials to remain at their posts, they were obeyed. When directives were absent, uncertainty followed. The conclusion was difficult to avoid. The emperor was not simply a symbol of the old regime. He was the only functioning control mechanism the occupation could immediately access. By September 1945, General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, began to consolidate authority over occupation policy. His headquarters reviewed intelligence assessments, troop availability, and political constraints simultaneously. According to staff records, MacArthur showed little interest in abstract debates about guilt. His focus was operational. The question he confronted was not whether the emperor deserved punishment. It was whether removing him would make Japan ungovernable. This was the first door that closed. By accepting the emperor as a stabilizing instrument, American planners began to abandon the assumption that victory alone determined post-war order. Instead, they acknowledged a harder reality, that symbols could outlast armies, and that destroying a system did not necessarily dismantle belief. From this point forward, the occupation would move in only one direction, toward preservation rather than eradication, toward control rather than retribution. The choice was not yet public. No announcement had been made. No trial parameters had been set. But inside occupation planning rooms, the logic was already narrowing. The war was over. The problem remained. By late September 1945, the occupation of Japan had begun to settle into routines. American troops arrived in orderly columns. Ports were secured. Airfields were catalogued. Government ministries resumed daily operations under supervision. On the surface, the transition appeared calm, almost deceptively so. Beneath that calm sat a series of unresolved calculations. Occupation doctrine assumed that authority had to be centralized quickly. Fragmented control invited delay. Delay invited resistance. The United States had learned this lesson repeatedly in earlier interventions. Power vacuums did not remain empty for long. Japan presented a paradox. Its formal leadership had surrendered, but its administrative machinery still functioned. Police reported for duty. Civil servants processed documents. Trains ran. Food distribution, though strained, continued. This was not the aftermath American planners had anticipated when they began drafting invasion scenarios in 1944. The system had not collapsed. It had paused. Intelligence officers struggled to explain why. Bombing surveys showed devastation on a scale unmatched in modern warfare. Urban centers lay in ruins. Industrial output had fallen precipitously. Yet social cohesion remained largely intact. There were no mass uprisings. No widespread looting. No open defiance. The explanation pointed upward. Orders were still being followed because the structure issuing them still existed. By October 1945, occupation reports increasingly framed the emperor not as a political actor, but as a transmission node. His personal views were considered secondary. What mattered was his position in the chain of obedience. Remove him, and the chain fractured. Preserve him, and it remained usable. This was not a conclusion reached lightly. American officials were aware of the contradictions involved. The emperor's authority had been mobilized in service of war. His image had appeared on proclamations urging sacrifice and endurance. Yet that same authority now offered a way to demobilize the population without force. Occupation planners faced a narrowing set of options. They could dismantle the imperial institution and attempt to rebuild legitimacy from scratch, through military rule, legal reforms, and prolonged enforcement. Or they could redirect an existing source of legitimacy, reshaping its function while leaving its form intact. Time favored the second option. Demobilization pressures in the United States intensified through the autumn of 1945. Units scheduled for redeployment pressed for timelines. Congressional scrutiny increased. The public narrative emphasized closure and return. The occupation of Japan was expected to be decisive, not indefinite. Within this context, troop estimates took on heightened importance. Staff planners produced revised projections. Each scenario was tested against likely responses: compliance, passive resistance, localized violence. In the scenarios where the emperor was removed, whether through trial, execution, or forced abdication, occupation forces expanded dramatically. Garrison requirements rose. Patrol density increased. Intelligence operations multiplied. In scenarios where the emperor remained, those requirements shrank. The contrast was stark. One internal assessment circulated in October suggested that retaining imperial authority could reduce occupation troop needs by several 100,000 over the first 3 years. Another warned that eliminating the emperor might require sustained force levels comparable to wartime deployments, particularly in rural regions. The language of these documents was clinical. There were no moral arguments. No references to justice or precedent. Only logistics, probabilities, and risk. At headquarters, maps remained open longer than usual. MacArthur's staff began reframing the occupation not as a punitive mission, but as a management problem. Japan was to be stabilized, not remade overnight. Reform would be gradual. Authority would be redirected, not destroyed. This reframing had consequences. Once the occupation was conceived as an exercise in control rather than reckoning, certain outcomes became less negotiable. The emperor's role shifted from liability to asset. His continued presence was no longer an uncomfortable compromise. It was an enabling condition. Yet this logic carried an implicit cost. Preserving the emperor meant limiting the scope of accountability. It meant drawing boundaries around responsibility. It meant deciding, in advance, which questions would not be pursued too aggressively. This tension surfaced quietly in discussions about war crimes prosecutions. Legal officers began outlining potential indictments. Names were listed. Chains of command were traced. The emperor's position sat uncomfortably at the top of every organizational chart. Each time, the same issue arose. If responsibility flowed upward, it eventually reached him. And if it reached him, the occupation's stabilizing assumption collapsed. By November 1945, a consensus had begun to form, not publicly, not formally, but functionally. The emperor would not be tried. His role would be redefined. Responsibility would be redistributed downward. The occupation would proceed on this basis. No announcement marked this shift. No directive spelled it out in plain language. But the pattern of decisions became unmistakable. Investigations were steered. Testimony was scoped. Emphasis moved away from institutional symbolism and toward individual culpability. The door to full accountability had not slammed shut. It had simply been left unopened. From here on, the occupation would depend on a single premise: that authority could be separated from responsibility, and that the symbol at the center of Japan's political culture could be preserved while its meaning was quietly altered. Whether this separation would hold remained uncertain. But the alternative had already been judged too costly to pursue. The war had ended. The occupation had begun. And one assumption, about how victory translated into justice, was already giving way under pressure. From this point forward, events would move toward accommodation, not confrontation. By late September 1945, the occupation of Japan had reached a decisive moment. Administrative systems were functioning. Orders were being carried out. Compliance, though fragile, was widespread. Yet one unresolved variable still hovered over every planning document and intelligence summary. The emperor himself had not yet been confronted. For weeks after the surrender, American authorities deliberately delayed any direct contact between Douglas MacArthur and Emperor Hirohito. The delay was not accidental. Staff officers debated the risks carefully. The optics mattered. The order mattered. Who summoned whom would signal where authority now rested. On September 27, 1945, the meeting finally took place at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. The setting was intentionally controlled. No ceremonial guard. No imperial regalia. No public announcement beforehand. The emperor arrived in formal civilian dress, accompanied by aides. MacArthur did not wear his dress uniform. He did not rise immediately. Observers noted the imbalance at once. Physically, the contrast was stark. MacArthur stood tall, informal, unyielding. Hirohito appeared smaller, reserved, almost diminished. Photographs taken afterward would circulate widely, but at the time, the meaning of the meeting was still being decided inside the room. Accounts of what was said remain limited, reconstructed from staff recollections and later memoirs. What is consistent across sources is not dramatic dialogue, but procedural clarity. Hirohito did not argue. He did not defend policy. According to multiple post-war accounts, He offered to accept responsibility for the war's outcome. The gesture was not theatrical. It was framed as obligation. MacArthur listened. For the Supreme Commander, this moment resolved an uncertainty that months of planning could not. The Emperor was not defiant. He was not attempting to preserve power through negotiation. He was prepared to submit. That submission altered the equation. MacArthur did not respond by accepting the offer. He did not outline charges or consequences. Instead, he shifted the frame entirely. Responsibility, he implied, would be addressed elsewhere. What mattered now was cooperation. From that point forward, the relationship between occupation authority and imperial authority took on a defined structure. Protection flowed downward. Compliance flowed upward. The emperor would remain. In return, he would issue directives that aligned with occupation objectives. The arrangement was never formalized in a single document. There was no treaty clause spelling it out. Yet its effects were immediate. Within days, imperial statements began reinforcing occupation policies. Public messages urged calm, obedience, and acceptance of reform. Military holdouts were instructed to stand down. Civil officials were told to remain at their posts and follow Allied guidance. The emperor's voice, once reserved for declarations of war and sacrifice, now carried instructions for compliance. Occupation reports noted the change. Where uncertainty had lingered, orders now carried weight. Where hesitation had surfaced, it receded. The population did not need to be convinced of American authority. It needed permission to obey it. That permission came from the emperor. MacArthur later reflected that the meeting confirmed his belief that the imperial institution could be redirected without being dismantled. According to staff notes, he viewed the emperor less as a decision-maker and more as a conduit. Authority no longer originated with him, but it still passed through him. This distinction mattered. By redefining the emperor's role, the occupation avoided confronting the deeper symbolic consequences of removal. The institution remained intact, but its function changed. The emperor would no longer command. He would authenticate. This recalibration had immediate implications for the occupation's legal and political trajectory. If the emperor was to be preserved as a stabilizing instrument, then public scrutiny of his wartime role had to be constrained. Questions could not be allowed to escalate into challenges to his legitimacy. The meeting thus closed another door. From that moment on, the occupation was no longer debating whether the emperor would remain. It was deciding how thoroughly his past would be insulated from examination. Justice, in its fullest sense, had become incompatible with stability. The meeting of September 27 did not resolve every uncertainty. But it fixed the direction of the occupation. Authority would be centralized through cooperation rather than force. Compliance would be managed through symbols rather than suppression. The choice had been made quietly, without announcement, but its consequences would shape every subsequent decision. From here on, the occupation would move toward preservation, not rupture. The emperor would stay. The system would adapt. And the reckoning would be redirected elsewhere. By November 1945, the structure of the occupation had solidified. Authority flowed through a clear hierarchy. American directives moved downward through Japanese ministries. Compliance moved upward through existing channels. Stability, though fragile, had been achieved without widespread coercion. With control established, the occupation turned to its next unavoidable task, accountability. The Allied commitment to war crimes prosecution had been articulated long before Japan's surrender. Declarations issued in 1943 and 1944 promised legal reckoning for those responsible for aggression and atrocities. The precedent had already been set in Europe. The machinery of justice was expected to follow victory. Yet Japan posed a problem that Germany had not. Responsibility in the Japanese system did not rest neatly with ministers or generals alone. Orders were issued in the emperor's name. Authority was formally centralized, even when operational decisions were delegated. Any serious attempt to trace responsibility upward risked intersecting with the imperial institution itself. Occupation legal planners were aware of this from the outset. By late 1945, preparatory work began for what would become the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. Charges were drafted. Categories of crimes were defined. Lists of potential defendants circulated among Allied legal teams. Each list grew shorter as it moved upward. The emperor's name did not appear. This omission was not accidental. According to later accounts from prosecution staff, guidance from occupation authorities emphasized caution. Investigations were to focus on operational responsibility, not symbolic authority. Evidence chains that led toward the emperor were quietly set aside. The reasoning was pragmatic. A public trial of the emperor would destabilize the occupation's core assumption that authority could be redirected without dismantling belief. Even a symbolic indictment risked undoing months of carefully constructed compliance. The emperor's cooperation was not guaranteed under legal attack. Neither was public order. Legal doctrine yielded to occupation logic. As the tribunal took shape in early 1946, attention shifted toward individuals whose removal would satisfy demands for justice without threatening systemic control. Political leaders, military planners, and field commanders became the focal points. Responsibility was redistributed downward, framed as the result of individual decisions rather than institutional design. One figure emerged as central to this approach: Hideki Tojo. Tojo had served as prime minister during much of the war. He was publicly associated with expansion, mobilization, and discipline. His position made him a plausible apex of culpability without implicating the emperor directly. During interrogation and pre-trial proceedings, Tojo accepted responsibility readily. According to post-war records, he did not attempt to shift blame upward. He spoke in terms of duty, obligation, and command. The emperor's role was described as constitutional, ceremonial, removed from operational control. This narrative aligned neatly with occupation needs. Prosecutors did not challenge it aggressively. Evidence that might have complicated the picture, imperial conference records, decision-making timelines, advisory memoranda, was handled selectively. The tribunal's scope narrowed not through formal exclusion, but through emphasis. Some questions were asked repeatedly. Others were never pressed. The trial proceeded. Publicly, it was framed as the rule of law asserting itself after catastrophe. Privately, it functioned as containment. Justice was being delivered, but within boundaries that protected the occupation's foundation. By November 1948, sentences were handed down. Several defendants were condemned to death. Others received life imprisonment. The verdicts were definitive. Responsibility had been assigned. The war was given a legal endpoint. The emperor remained untouched. This outcome carried a cost that was acknowledged only later. By separating authority from accountability, the tribunal reinforced a version of history that emphasized aberration over structure. War became the result of misguided individuals rather than systemic consensus. The imperial institution emerged preserved, cleansed of direct culpability. At the time, this trade-off was accepted as necessary. Occupation authorities judged that justice constrained by stability was preferable to justice that destabilized the peace. The war had already exacted unprecedented destruction. The priority now was preventing further violence, not satisfying abstract principles. Another door closed. With the trials concluded, the narrative of responsibility hardened. What could have been examined no longer would be. The occupation had fixed its interpretation, and that interpretation would shape Japan's post-war political memory for generations. From here on, the emperor's role would not be debated in courtrooms. It would be managed through image. And that management would require something more deliberate than silence. By early 1946, the occupation faced a quieter but equally consequential challenge. Military control had been established. Legal accountability had been circumscribed. The emperor had been preserved. Yet preservation alone was not enough. Meaning had to be reshaped. Before the war, the emperor's authority had been inseparable from sacrifice, expansion, and obedience unto death. That meaning could not simply be erased. If left untouched, it risked reactivating itself under new conditions. Stability required not just control, but reinterpretation. Occupation authorities understood this clearly. By January 1946, planners began addressing what internal memoranda referred to as the symbol problem. The emperor could not remain what he had been, even in diminished form. His continued legitimacy depended on a controlled transformation, one that would be visible, repetitive, and difficult to reverse. On January 1, 1946, the emperor issued what became known as the Humanity Declaration. It renounced the concept of divine status. The language was carefully chosen. It did not deny cultural tradition outright. It reframed it. The declaration spoke of mutual trust, shared humanity, and continuity without transcendence. The shift was subtle but decisive. This was not a spontaneous admission. Drafts had been reviewed. Phrasing had been negotiated. The declaration functioned less as confession than as recalibration. Authority was preserved, but its metaphysical foundation was withdrawn. For the occupation, this was a critical step. By detaching obedience from divinity, compliance could be maintained without sanctification. The emperor could remain visible without remaining untouchable. What followed was a sustained effort in image management. Occupation authorities coordinated closely with Japanese officials to redesign public appearances. The emperor was photographed in civilian clothing, often in a simple suit and tie. Military regalia disappeared. Ceremonial distance was reduced. He was shown walking among factory workers, visiting schools, touring damaged neighborhoods. These appearances were not improvised. Routes were planned. Angles were selected. Captions were written. The intent was consistent: to present continuity without command, presence without power. The transformation was gradual, not abrupt. Too sudden a shift risked disbelief. Too slow a shift risked ambiguity. The pace was calibrated carefully, month by month. Public response was monitored. Occupation reports tracked compliance levels, rumor circulation, and local sentiment. There were no mass protests. No visible backlash. The population adjusted, not enthusiastically, but pragmatically. The emperor remained, but he no longer spoke of destiny or sacrifice. He spoke of rebuilding. This reframing served multiple purposes. For the Japanese public, it offered a way to reconcile defeat without repudiating identity. For the occupation, it reinforced stability while preventing the emperor from re-emerging as a political rallying point. Authority remained centralized, but its emotional charge was neutralized. By mid-1946, the transformation was sufficiently established to support constitutional reform. Japan's new constitution, promulgated later that year, codified the emperor's symbolic role explicitly. Sovereignty was transferred to the people. The emperor became a figure of state, not of rule. This legal change formalized what the occupation had already achieved psychologically. The emperor's continued presence no longer threatened reform. It facilitated it. Yet this success rested on a fragile foundation. The transformation depended on controlled memory. Certain questions remained unasked. Certain narratives were emphasized over others. The emperor's wartime role faded into abstraction, replaced by a carefully managed image of continuity and humility. This was not historical resolution. It was historical management. Another door closed. With legitimacy manufactured and stabilized, the occupation could begin preparing its exit. The system no longer required constant enforcement. Compliance had been normalized. Authority had been redirected. But the cost of that normalization would only become clear later, when historians, journalists, and scholars began asking which parts of the past had been deliberately left untouched. The occupation had succeeded. But it had also fixed the terms under which the war would be remembered. From here on, the consequences would no longer be immediate. They would be archival. By the end of 1947, the occupation of Japan had entered its final phase. Institutions were functioning. Elections had been held. A new constitution was in force. American troop levels were declining. What had once been framed as a potentially unstable military occupation was now being described, in official reports, as a managed transition. Measured by its own criteria, the occupation was a success. There had been no widespread insurgency. No prolonged campaign of repression. No need for the massive troop reinforcements planners had once feared. Japan complied, rebuilt, and re-entered the international system with remarkable speed. The emperor remained. This outcome validated the original calculation. Preserving the imperial institution had reduced costs, shortened timelines, and stabilized governance. From an operational standpoint, the decision had worked. Yet success carried consequences that extended beyond logistics. By choosing stability over confrontation, the occupation fixed a particular interpretation of responsibility into the historical record. The war was explained as the product of militarists, extremists, and rogue decision-makers. Structural consensus faded from view. Institutional continuity was preserved without institutional reckoning. This framing shaped memory. Post-war Japan rebuilt itself around narratives of suffering, endurance, and recovery. The devastation of cities, the trauma of defeat, and the hardships of reconstruction became central reference points. The question of how authority had been mobilized before 1945 receded into abstraction. The emperor's survival made this possible. Because he remained, continuity could be maintained without reopening foundational questions. The state did not have to explain itself anew. It could reinterpret itself gradually. Responsibility was diffused. The past was not denied, but it was softened. American officials understood this trade-off at the time. Internal memoranda from the late occupation period acknowledged that preserving legitimacy had come at the cost of clarity. But clarity was not the objective. Order was. The war had already demonstrated what happened when assumptions collapsed too quickly. In 1945, the priority was preventing another collapse. From a distance, the decision appears almost inevitable. Demobilization pressures, geopolitical realignments, and limited resources left little room for moral maximalism. The emerging Cold War further reinforced the need for a stable Japan. By 1948, attention had shifted elsewhere. The occupation's foundational choices were no longer revisited. What remained was precedent. The decision to preserve the emperor demonstrated that symbols could be repurposed without being dismantled. That legitimacy could be engineered. That justice could be bounded by strategy. These lessons would echo through later conflicts, occupations, and interventions. They also left unresolved questions. What does accountability mean when authority is preserved? What is lost when systems are stabilized without being fully examined? And how much of history is shaped not by what is remembered, but by what is made unnecessary to confront? The occupation of Japan answered these questions pragmatically, not philosophically. It chose continuity over rupture, control over reckoning, usefulness over judgment. The emperor did not remain because the war absolved him. He remained because removing him would have made the peace harder to win. That was the calculation. And once made, it could not be undone. The war had ended. The system had adapted. And history moved forward, carrying with it a version of the past shaped less by truth than by what stability required at the time. If you've made it this far, you understand that history isn't decided in a single moment. It's shaped by timing, hesitation, and the decisions people make when options begin to close. If this perspective speaks to you, consider subscribing for future episodes. As the war itself would prove, once events are set in motion, they rarely wait for permission.